Good afternoon, guys, and welcome to another edition of the Debrief Podcast. I'm Josh Durso, joined as always by Jackie Augustine. We're here inside the FingerLakes1.com studio. September is rolling to a close. Primaries are over. The political season is in full swing. And here we are, Jackie, again.
Yeah, I guess this is when people start paying attention if they weren't already, and where those of us who were paying attention take like a short 2-week hiatus from paying attention before really getting right back into it again, because I think it got a little bit of potential overload there in the run-up to the primaries with all the kind of stuff that was being thrown at each of the candidates. And now I think everyone can take a deep breath and just say, okay, now let's look at what the November slate is actually going to bring.
And I think that's interesting, too, because this isn't an intense year, per se. It's a midterm year, not a lot of local elections with implications, not as many as will be, for example, next year.
Right.
And I think you're right. A lot of folks are probably taking the last couple weeks of September to, one, enjoy the weather, and then two, think about things before they really start to dive into this general election cycle, which will be interesting. Speaking of the cycle, primary recap, were there any surprises to the point of, the state? I mean, I wasn't really surprised about the way the primary for governor turned out at all.
No, I was not surprised by the result. I was kind of surprised the tone it took the last week. There was that state mailer in New York City that basically kind of questioned whether or not Cynthia Nixon might be anti-Semitic, which seems crazy. And I just thought, wow, I mean, people must think Cuomo's really in trouble, which I didn't get that sense all along. So
right.
That, I guess, kind of surprised me. But I think the happy news, which I was pleasantly surprised. I don't want to say it was a surprise because this is the way it should have been, but in my view. But this breaking up of the Independent Democratic Caucus is excellent. So a lot of these senators who have been in these questionable dealings trying to curry favor with the majority, because for people who don't know, we have a Democratic Assembly, but we have a Republican majority Senate. So there were a group of Democrats who split from the Democratic Party, who otherwise would have had a majority, and basically sold out to the Republicans in order to keep some very questionable practices afloat, including some campaign finance stuff and the LLC loophole. So I was incredibly pleased to see that people are onto them and that 6 of the 8 of them lost their primaries. So unless they might appear on the ballot on an independence or none of them are on the Working Families line, but they might have secured another ballot line, but the chances of them actually retaining their seats are very low. And I say, good, well-deserved comeuppance, because they had not been conducting themselves in good faith for the people of the state. So I think that's good news for us locally, because better state government will lead to better local decision making. But yeah.
So as you're going through talking about that, I had found this. I think it was like a day or two. The New York Times published this story, 5 takeaways from the primary involving Cuomo and Nixon, and the quote here, as you can see on your screen if you're watching us on YouTube, Cuomo kept it old school, it worked. He had the unions, he had the money, he had the television ads and mailers, she had the buzz, she had the celebrity, she had what seemed like the grassroots energy, she got crushed. To me, that sort of sums up where state politics is right now.
Well,
and I get it.
Yeah.
Like, there's a lot of hope that, okay, things are changing, things are going in the right direction.
Right.
But guess what? It just happened. We watched it happen.
Sure, but I would also say the big piece there is he's an incumbent. So I think that it was less about Cuomo's election strategy and more about the fact that incumbents have an advantage. And let's not forget, he has been appearing and peppering funds throughout the state, setting the stage for a lot of goodwill that carried into this election.
Right, and I think the point that, at least the point that I was thinking about was like, if an incumbent doesn't have money, doesn't have the millions and millions of dollars that Cuomo had, are they as effective as Cuomo was moving through this past primary? Because it seemed like the writing was on the wall that if there were ever going to be a time to knock him off in this type of contest, in a primary contest, this was going to be the year for it to happen. Right. And for it not to happen, and not only not happen, but for it to be effectively a blistering outcome. Right. I think she secured, a little over 34% of the vote, matching what Zephyr Teachout did in 2014. That to me says that, for all of the progress that a lot of people, I think, hope we're making,
right, I
don't think nearly as much has actually been made.
Yeah, I also think her candidacy was not ideal. So yes, this was probably the best year for someone to mount a primary challenge. I don't think she was necessarily the best candidate to carry that forward. So I don't want to say that grassroots organizing didn't work this time or that there wasn't enough change in the air. I think it was, in some ways, a personality contest, and I think in some ways it was about momentum. And did she make a compelling enough case that we needed to break the momentum? And frankly, on some issues, absolutely yes, but I don't think enough to tip the balance. And that, I don't know, that's my assessment of why. But who knows? I mean, maybe, you never know. You never know what motivates people when they're in the voting booth.
Now, what about the AG's race? Any change there in terms of, were you happy, content, interested by the outcome or how things shaped up in that contest?
Well, I definitely think everybody got the down ballot advantage of being part of Cuomo's team. I was disappointed that Zephyr Teachout did not win the Attorney General's primary because I thought, without a doubt, she was incredibly qualified and actually had the statewide knowledge to be able to be a really excellent representative of state interests across the board. Mm-hmm. So that I felt was disappointing. But I think the top of the ticket got most of the attention, so you can't really fault people for going with the names that were associated with the top of the ticket.
Right. Yeah, and I think, one of the big takeaways that I was sort of thinking about afterward and kind of wondering, because it was one of the things that I thought I was going to take away from the primary before it actually happened, was this whole debate around how much did this primary contest actually prepare Governor Cuomo for his challenge in the general election. And you know what? I think I feel even more strongly than I did before the primary about it not doing anything good in any way, shape, or form for him heading into the general election. It seemed like he moved the way the party wanted him to move throughout the primary process and direction as far as latitude on the issues. Mm-hmm. And he looked like a beatable candidate throughout the process. He may have had the money in the war chest and the political chips in the right spots to win this primary contest, but a general election's much different. And, I just think to myself, what would this have looked like if it were a stronger or more formidable candidate that were placed before voters in this primary process? Right. So a more similar to Cuomo and less like Nixon candidate, a more central Democratic option. I think Cuomo could have been beat, and I think that would have been a real preview for what voters probably want more than anything, at least as far as the general feeling goes. I think there's a little bit of desire for something more stable or something more less to the polls.
Yeah, well, I think that what people would... I think Cuomo's vulnerability right now is articulating a plan to actually implement some reform on this corruption end. That is an incredible vulnerability. I mean, Cynthia Nixon would not have gone for that if she didn't recognize that that was going to resonate with people. I think across New York State, especially in upstate, I think people have been starting to get tuned in to the fact that stuff going on in Albany is not in our interest. So while economic development awards and other revitalization efforts are good and should continue, I don't think those monies are going to be enough in general to distract upstate voters from their bigger concerns about how the legislature has been governed, and particularly how that has affected things like school funding. And again, I've said I think Molinaro, being a county executive, is going to be able to talk about that in a way that people will actually understand and will see the impact. I think Cynthia Nixon was good at kind of pointing out the problem and calling Cuomo on the carpet about a couple of things. But then there wasn't an alternative proposal that people could understand how it would affect their daily lives. I think Molinaro, and definitely Stephanie Miner, who you know, full disclosure, I think would be a great candidate, great governor. I think that they are going to be able to say, and here's how it's going to work, and here's what it's going to look like for your school taxes, for your unfunded mandate payments, for workers' comp, for these things that people deal with every day and have to wrestle with, especially this time of year when your school and property tax bills are coming due.
Right.
That's the issue.
Yeah, people see all of these political issues as management issues, and I think that's probably why we saw the rise of a Donald Trump into presidency, because there was this perception that he was the businessman. He could manage, he could create plans and whether it was right or wrong is pretty much irrelevant when it's just a reflection of what the pulse of the voter is at this point.
Yeah, I hope you're not showing my face right now.
But it goes back to the point that it's a very basic fundamental thing that voters are looking for right now. They aren't looking for the political flash or anything too exciting. They just are looking for basic answers. And to that point, what you just said, I think it's spot on, because I do think that a county executive, somebody who has that management experience, is poised to be in a really good place in a contest against Cuomo.
Yeah.
Another story that we've been following that I think is super, super interesting. I'm going to put it up on the screen for people so they can see it as we talk about it here. Victor Woman says racial bias has followed her and her boyfriend, Derek McNeil, since moving to Victor last year. McNeil was coming home from work last week, and he was stopped by deputies. He was put through a series of field sobriety tests. It was about 1:30 in the morning. He works construction. The car was stripped of its plates. He was threatened jail time. Nothing was found. The only issues that were basically found through this entire stop was that the registration and insurance couldn't be found. It was the vehicle was both registered and insured, but because it was his girlfriend's car, and he was driving back with friends to work on his own vehicle at her home, he didn't know where it was in the car, so they took the plates off of it, took off. The whole stop took place literally right in their driveway. The cops didn't knock on the door, didn't seek her out to get an answer on, why does this person, if you think it's suspicious, why does this person have your vehicle or is driving your vehicle at 1:30 in the morning? None of that happened. So the next day, she sends the sergeant that's on staff in the morning with the sheriff's office a picture of all of the documentation that they needed, and they said everything was cleared up. Obviously, these two individuals don't feel like everything is cleared up. They feel like this is systemic, this is an issue, this is something that they've seen happen over and over and over again. Victor is a community that's roughly 95% white. Mm-hmm. It raises a lot of interesting questions, but my big questions was afterward, what does this actually clear up? To say that, well, we aren't ticketing you, we aren't charging you with anything, that doesn't seem to cut it.
No.
Right?
No. I mean, it would be great if after one of these incidents, I mean, obviously it would be great if there were none of these incidents, but look at what's happening. They're continuing to happen. It would be nice if at some point after one of these incidents, someone would stand up and say, you know what? You're right. Like, we are treating people with a heightened suspicion, or we are having a heightened sense of fear based on people's skin color. And there's no more denying it. I think if that has not been the lesson of 2018, the lesson of 2017, the lesson of the century, but it's time for police departments, in order to maintain a sense of legitimacy in their communities, to say that there is an undeniable pattern of heightened suspicion and disparate treatment. Like this, I don't know, we've talked about this before, that there have been situations. There was a situation in Seneca County in Border City a year and a half ago where a white man came out and confronted police officers with a gun. It was the front page picture on the Finger Lakes Times of the officers responding appropriately, calming down the situation, talking to him, getting the gun, making an arrest. That is not the scene that we have seen involving people of color.
Yeah, and I look at it kind of through that, well, how would be the best way to handle this individual situation? Well, it seems like this is your golden opportunity, if you're ever going to have one, to it's a training opportunity. Take it. Learn from this particular incident so that you don't have future incidents that are like it. Right. You have to, at some point, whether you admit you have a problem or not, you have to do something so that the same thing doesn't keep happening over and over again.
Right.
Whether the admission comes later after the training is completed and after, change is visible from the outside, in my mind, doesn't matter as much as the real change matters.
Yeah. And it's a measurement issue, right? Because, the police department could come back and say, actually, across stops of a similar nature, this is exactly how we've treated every single driver, regardless of race.
Oh, yeah, which
barring that, then they would say, actually, there are no other drivers we've treated this way. It just so happens the only person we've treated this way is a person of color. Or, again, and then they could say, this means if it's a training opportunity, we will then track this over the next year and then report back and tell you how many incidents like this we have again. Hopefully none. And if we have any, we're going to let you know the racial background and composition of anybody who was involved in it. Like real accountability, like real transparency with numbers.
Yeah, and it's interesting, too, because I'm not entirely sure. Right now, the Ontario County Sheriff's Office is going through a transition period as far as leadership goes. Sheriff Pavro is serving out his last few months before he retires. There will be a new sheriff in town, so to speak, in January. And I think really what it comes down to is it's on whoever that person is to sort of take the reins and, say, across the board, I'm pretty sure that even if we take, for 5 seconds, we take race out of the equation, I'm sure we can identify many, many, many different ways that law enforcement can be better and can be improved, not just for those folks in the community who have to deal with them, but also for the sake of those who are doing law enforcement as a career. Right. Just make it better, get better, and put this what is seemed to become it's almost a new story every day of this type of nature where it's just easily preventable. There should be a policy, there should be a procedure, and if the numbers skew a certain way so that you can make that argument that you're saying, then you need to find a new way to handle that situation. You need to find a different way to go down that road. Right. And there again, because this is, supposing that the two officers handled this situation precisely the way they were supposed to, precisely as their supervisors would have expected them to, exactly as the rules of engagement from their perspective should have been followed, it still doesn't, it puts them in a bad spot. Right. Because it's not giving them the right tools, the right resources to be able to do their job the right way, the appropriate way, the effective way. Yeah, and I think, there again, we hear a lot about community policing. We hear a lot about this. I think that's just another buzzword. When something like this happens, they will point to community policing and say, well, we're doing this, this, and this to be in the community and engage in this very public, dynamic, and public way. Okay. Yeah. That's pretty much where I am at now with hearing that type of language about it, because I'm not entirely sure that there's enough evidence to say that it's working. It's changing anything. We certainly don't have the data that you've been talking about. Right. So, maybe another couple of years we'll have another conversation about this. Oh, wait, no, it'll probably be 2 or 3 weeks, because that's how frequently these stories pop up.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's becoming something that people are so used to hearing about that it doesn't even spark the level of outrage that it should. And the thing is, you've got so many people who immediately get defensive and say, well, the police are doing a tough job and, lay off. Well, nobody's saying it's not a tough job. But the point is, why would you want to make it more difficult by having people not getting the training they need to be able to do the job without being criticized for the way it's being handled? Right. Like, if something is so blatantly out of line with general procedure, then that is opening the entire department up for criticism. So it's in the police department's best interest to try and take all of these issues seriously and, meet the needs of the public. I'm not really sure how else to say it.
Yeah, and I think this is, it's worth pointing out that we see this conversation, I think, happen in places like Geneva and Rochester, cities like that, more frequently than we do associated with the sheriff's offices or, more rural communities. But I think it's equally a problem across the board and needs to be addressed across the board. So let's shift gears again. I've been waiting to talk about this for like 3 weeks, I think. Okay. I didn't know that Canandaigua was going to be the local community that jumped on board with this attempt to ban single-use plastic straws. But it's been done. San Francisco, Seattle, larger cities mainly, but now we're starting to see it trickle down to the local level. So the numbers basically bear out to say that, each person creates around 88 pounds of plastic waste per year. That's 300 million metric tons in all in 2015 of plastic waste, which is pretty incredible. Now there's this debate around straws, and it's interesting to me because I hate straws to begin with. I feel like we've all graduated from the sippy cup, and we don't need an assist when we're drinking, anything. That said, I get it. I know people, it's not to say I never use straws. If in the morning when I get my iced coffee in the car, it's kind of tough to navigate the lid situation and straw. I get that. But there's a few things. So I don't like straws. I also hate the whole idea of paper straws. Is that not strange to you? Like, to me, that's just because it takes this whole concept of like, well, it can be recycled.
Right.
Does that mean it will be recycled?
Right. Yeah. I mean, even if it's not, I guess it would break down faster than a plastic straw would. But I'm with you. I don't understand straws. I'm not going to say I've never used a straw, because sometimes when you order a drink, the straw's already in it.
Yep.
And then even if you set it on the table, they're not going to reuse it. They're not going to put it in somebody else's drink. So for me, I think all of these laws, whether they pass or not, all of these attempts, whether it's plastic grocery bags, plastic straws, are all an attempt to just get people to think for a second about what's going on. Like, if for some reason, I don't know, if you've got some kind of medical condition that you need to use a straw, well, then there should be no reason that you can't have access to one, But for a waitress to come over, hand everybody a glass of water, which some people don't even drink the water that they're given at the table, and then they have a straw in each of those, that seems like unnecessarily wasteful. So if this causes people to say, you know what, from now on straws are just going to be optional, that would be a start. That would be a great thing. But I do think, I don't know that we have a constitutional right to straws. I don't know if that is something that people are going to get upset about and say, you can't take my straws, and you can get my straw over my dead body. Like, I'm not really sure it's going to be a showdown in that way. But
I think it does put businesses in a weird spot. So if you own a restaurant, I think there is sort of like a reteaching, I guess, that would have to happen, and sort of a relearning of, how we do things, and, what the alternatives are. And because the other thing, too, that I always think about when it comes to the straw, I know some of my friends use the reusable straws, like the stainless steel ones.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Are you putting them through the dishwasher? Are you
I don't know.
How are you washing? Like, to me, a straw is just, I'm afraid of utensils that like have nuanced little like crevices and like lips on them, because I wonder like how effectively you can really clean them to begin with. And I just wonder, like, this is just another example to me, like, how clean can that really stay? And then we've got a new problem that we're introducing into the situation: dirty straws.
Now, see, the way I see it is, this is the same reason we should get rid of hand sanitizer, right? Like, we could all do to have a little more exposure to germs. It's good for our immune systems.
No.
No, I am not saying that they should be providing us reusable straws. I just don't know. I'm not a straw lover, so this to me just seems like, stop just automatically putting a straw in every drink. If businesses can just have some available, if you need one, you get one. If you don't need one, then
listen,
you're
I
fine.
know it's only a matter of time before we see a letter to the editor or something in one of the publications, whether it's the Messenger or the Times, or here on Finger Lakes one, where somebody says, I own a business, and this is going to result in me having to raise prices. I almost can just guarantee it. Yeah, I don't know what plastic straws actually cost a bar or a restaurant. I don't. But you know what? I'm sure the reusable option. I'm not really sure how a business would handle that situation. And since it's always, oh no, more regulation, and I'm sympathetic to that, because that seems to be the trend. I don't really know that this is one of those hills that, folks should think about dying on. Yeah. Straws. Imagine that. We're talking about straws. It's sad. So another interesting story, big story up in Geneva. Two of them, actually. The Welcome Center. Mm-hmm. What's going on with that? What's going on up there? So most people probably saw the WHEC story,
yes.
The investigative report where some astronomical numbers were exposed for little construction tidbits here or there throughout that process. Yeah. But it seems like there's more, right?
Well, it's actually two different issues the way I see it. There's the WHEC report that was generally talking about how the state funded its portion. And granted, all the money came from the state, but some of it was administered directly by the state, and some of it was administered by the city using the state's money. And I think that the first issue that was raised by HEC, was the particular line items that the state had authorized. For example, they touted the fact that the canoes that make up the lights were donated, but the sign letting you know that they were donated, they spent $1,000 framing the sign to tell you about the donated canoes. So yes, this is another one of those situations where you hear about the government buying a $6,000 hammer or something, right? And that, I think, was the angle of the WHEC report. But then the state, to try to say, well, don't focus on us too much, we're only a quarter of the issue, the rest of the money was administered by the City of Geneva, kind of passed the buck over to Geneva, and that is what resulted in the Geneva Believer's FOIL request for the contracts, the invoices, the payments, to try to see if there was the same order of magnitude. Were the contractors for this being paid, $30,000 to put in a single light fixture or something? And I think the disappointing part of this request, which you're putting up on the screen, is that actually it appears that the paperwork is not readily at their fingertips. And that is a concern because the project is pretty new and it was a substantial project, and anything having to do with the state in general generates a lot of paperwork, duplicative, redundant paperwork. So that is certainly raising eyebrows, especially following a Finger Lakes Times piece that was, why do Massa and Iverson always seem to be the only contractors who get it? And the answer to this was that Iverson was contracted by the city to handle the bid process, and the bids went to Massa. So now you've got both contractors in one major project, and we're looking at, like $4 million that, well, looks like there's not an adequate paper trail for. Now, I'd like to give the city the benefit of the doubt that they do have this, that maybe the documents they don't have on hand were documents that had to be sent to the state for reimbursement, and that eventually those might be made available. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess the only upside is that it's not our individual City of Geneva property taxes at stake. I think obviously the downside is that it is our New York State property taxes collectively paid into that are at stake. Mm-hmm. And after the City Hall renovation debacle of the summertime, where the contract, again involving Massa, was under question, and you had a city councilor who used to be or may still be a subcontractor, like kind of lobbying for a quick award without a lot of scrutiny, it just doesn't look good. It looks haphazard.
So the portion of the story that I have up on the screen right now, of the Believer story, the Geneva Believer story, is the portion that looks at the editorial board piece by the Finger Lakes Times that ran, I believe, in early June. The print's too small. I can't read it from here. Let's welcome the FLX Welcome Center, something to that effect.
Right.
So I remember in that piece there being a lot of felt like frustration with some of the folks who frequently come out against various things that the city does, or whatever the case may be. It painted, in my opinion, the paper into a really tough corner, because the newspaper is supposed to be the watchdog of, as the Believer pointed out, the establishment, or, read whatever community you're in.
Yeah.
Supposed to be reporting objectively on it, and it seemed to take a firm stance. I have a column that runs in the Finger Lakes Times. I have a good relationship with most of the folks up there, and, everything is hunky-dory on that front. But I think this is, in this era where, journalists aren't just the folks who work in newspapers. They're on social media. They are everywhere. Mm-hmm. It's anybody who basically wants to take the time, like Jim Meany does with the Geneva Believer, to dig into issues of importance in the local community.
Right.
And making a stance through an editorial board, taking a stance, I think is an incredibly, incredibly risky thing to do, because it opens yourself up to a whole lot of things. It's similar. I feel similarly to this as I do about newspaper endorsements. We're going to be seeing those again in a couple months. Mm-hmm. And frankly, I just, in this day and age, 30, 40, 50 years ago, I think there was a place for it. And I've written a column about this too in the newspaper. There's a time and a place, and I'm not entirely sure that newspapers or any news organization in general, especially with the level of scrutiny that we see every single day regardless, I'm just not sure there's any space for it now.
Now, see, I might disagree with that, because in general, I think the idea of looking at the newspaper as the fourth estate, the idea that they are keeping people honest, double-checking the facts, reporting the facts, keeping people informed, needs to stay the central focus. I think where we find difficulty, I think an editorial board and an editorial position fits with that, insofar as if one agency has been repeatedly, consistently, thoroughly reporting the facts about what's going on, then I do think there is a level of public trust and interest in people hearing what the people who are following it closely think. So that's about like endorsements in general, that I think if the paper is doing a good job of thoroughly and completely getting the news out there in an objective way about what's really going on, then I think the endorsements and editorial content fit nicely with that.
See, I just want to jump in quickly, because I think that's based on the idea that from an era when newspapers were much more representative of the entire community.
Right.
And much larger newsrooms, much larger reach, much larger audiences. That's changed. That dynamic is gone. So what is it really representing at that point? You can have a handful of reporters, and this goes for even some of the larger newsrooms now, which really still aren't that large. You have a few people really investigating, really reporting on something, whereas 30, 40 years ago, it was an effort of the entire newsroom.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Definitely.
Dozens of people. And that dynamic is gone. And that's what worries me when, we're in this situation. You hear a lot of the criticism of newspapers and of news organizations in general for being slanted one way. It's because people don't feel like they're representative of the entire community. And that dynamic, I think, is really... It's such a fine line to walk that I just personally, I look at it, it's like, it can't be worth it.
Yeah. I mean, that is a question, whether or not it's worth it, whether it actually is in the paper's best interest to take a position. Those are definitely questions above my expertise and pay grade. But I think that, in general, the reason maybe that Welcome Center editorial rubbed people the wrong way is that it would have been one thing if there had been a series of articles about the Welcome Center contracts, how the work was going, how it was bid out, just general, what I guess people would say is dry news, just about what the process is. And then, if at the end of the day, the paper wants to come out and say, this is great and everything went well and hooray for us, I think people could appreciate that, because the question of whether or not the Welcome Center is a good thing, an asset, something to be proud of, is entirely separate from how the Welcome Center was developed, how the project progressed, whether or not anybody was unduly enriched for the level of work that was completed. Those are separate questions. So I think the pushback is not so much that the Finger Lakes Times said something, it's that they chose to say what they felt about the project without really giving people enough about what was really going on with the project.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I don't think we've seen the last of this.
Right.
I think this is probably... this is going to keep going, this one.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sad for the Finger Lakes Times that the Geneva Believer scooped the story about the FOIL request. I don't know if the Finger Lakes Times put in a FOIL request, but for me, the logical next move after seeing that WHEC story was, well, what about Geneva's money? And I think that was on the minds of a lot of people. So for Jim to have gone and done that legwork and to have this story, for me, I always tell people, subscribe to the paper, right? Like this the best way to get the best journalism is to support better journalism, right? To put more money into the coffers so that there can be more time and attention for more in-depth stuff. But I don't know. I mean, I think the Finger Lakes Times has such a large coverage area that they do a good job covering what they have to cover. But on an issue like this, I can understand the criticism because it does look like they missed a big story. Yeah,
it's tough, and there's a lot of different dynamics at play there. You've got the advertiser side of it. You've got all these different. You've got the short-staffed portion of the issue. The news business is changing in a lot of ways, but there is another story that we're going to be talking about, and I think we can jump right to it now. The story about how foreclosed properties are handled in Geneva, and I thought this was really interesting. This FLT Insider feature by the Finger Lakes Times that I think every couple Sundays or every other.
This is an excellent feature.
Takes a basic question, provides an answer.
Mm-hmm.
That is precisely what people are looking for. And in this case, a question basically arose about a person who was interested in seeing a property go to auction. It never went to auction. City wound up selling it to another person who had contacted the city independently. The city didn't deny it. They didn't deny the circumstances or anything. But how do you feel about this, given the nature and the scrutiny that municipalities like Geneva are under on a daily basis? It seems like there needs to be a better policy in place.
Yeah, I have always felt that the auction, every property goes to auction just to the highest bidder, has been the worst possible policy for disposing of property ever, because it essentially makes the outcome of the sale random and haphazard. And those are basically like, if you want good government, you do not want random government. I don't think random and good generally go together unless you're talking about like random acts of kindness. But random acts of government are not a good idea. So that is not good. So what used to happen is property gets foreclosed. Geneva opted out of Ontario County's general auction. So like the steps of City Hall, you'd have, guess what? Here's the property that's available. You can come bid on it. So people want to know why there was such a rise of absentee landlords. People find out like, hey, there's going to be an auction. Sure, I'll go in and put in a bid for $5,000, $7,000. And all of a sudden you've got a house. So I actually support the city taking a more strategic perspective towards how they deal with foreclosed properties, whether those are being taken for back taxes or are otherwise have been abandoned or something. But we have a master plan. It says certain things about certain neighborhoods, about certain priorities. I do believe that once the city identifies an intended use for a property, for a piece of property, that there should be an opportunity for an open process. So I, frankly, have had my eye on several properties that I thought could have a better use than what they have right now, and have thought, man, if that comes up for taxes, it should be used for X, Y, or Z.
Mm-hmm.
And, in my capacity as managing a nonprofit, I've approached the city about certain properties and said, you know what, we could use this for something great for the community. I would still expect that idea, let's say the city says, absolutely, that's the best idea, that's what we want to do. I would still expect that anybody else who would achieve that same objective would have an equal opportunity to purchase that property. I think it's fine for the city to determine an outcome, but I then think there still has to be a process that achieves that outcome.
Yeah, it's sloppy is the word that comes to mind. Yeah. But I think the big opportunity here is just coming up with a better process, and if it's a marketing issue, because I had sort of gotten the impression after reading it that maybe it was there wasn't really a huge opportunity to market these properties, all of the properties, all of the time. So they kind of, pick their battles, so to speak, which is fine. But I feel like there has to be an acknowledgement of that being an issue if you're going to use that as an excuse for circumventing a process that already exists. If the process is property goes to bid, right, and you're going to temporarily or from time to time allow that process to not happen and go a different route, then you've got to, right? I mean, you've got to acknowledge that. That's my question.
I'm not clear on what the process actually is start to finish right now. I think right now the process might be let's look at each property on a case-by-case basis and figure out what we want it to look like in terms of contributing to the neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And I think then, depending on what bucket it goes into, it's handled differently. I think the problem that people were having with this particular property, which I don't know the property and I don't know the developer, so I don't know who actually ended up purchasing it, but I think the problem was if it's a single-family house that's going to stay a single-family home, it seems like maybe the city could have just publicized that as a regular sale instead of just taking the first person who says, oh yeah, I'll buy it and here's how much I'll give for you. I'll give to you for it. So I don't know. I don't know enough about how that's handled, and I don't know what the volume of properties is at the moment to be able to figure out what a better process would be. But I guess I just want to say, in defense of the city, I'm glad that they don't just put things up for random auction anymore, because who knows, you could get a guy who says, yeah, I want to buy the lot next door to me because I'm going to pave the entire thing over and park 30 cars on it. Let me tell you, once that horse is out of the barn, that's what you're going to have. Right. That's not really fair to the neighbors. So I do think that the city has an interest in saying, we're going to hold these back, we're going to determine what it should be, and then we'll see if people are interested in that idea.
Yeah. So big issue, and this is one of those. This is probably the most interesting electoral story we have left on the docket, because we have a guy who, a representative who is facing insider trading charges, but is going to stay on the ballot.
Yeah,
he could be elected, and honestly, I looking at the voter composition of the district and looking at the trends, it could happen.
Yep.
It could really happen. Chris Collins could win re-election and continue serving
until convicted.
It is just so strange to me. And I've heard the theory that, well, this will, if he stays on the ballot and wins, it will force a process that doesn't allow the 12 or 10 or 12-ish party chairs in the counties that make up the 27th congressional district to hold all of the power. That to me, I don't like this. This to me just does damage to what this just screams awful. In every way. Like there is no way to sugarcoat it. There is no way to word it more effectively. This just screams awful.
Yeah, I mean, this is like the have they no shame moment where there's, well...
And to be clear, it seems like the party actually wants him out.
Yeah. I mean, we've talked about this in different contexts. Like, a lot of people are embroiled in these current kind of investigations and issues. And the idea that they are just going to stay no matter what, and you're not going to get them out of their congressional seat unless they're federally prohibited from serving. I just think, what kind of arrogance is it to think, not only am I the best person for this seat, but I am the person who, despite potential wrongdoing, now I understand he's going to say it's just alleged wrongdoing,
right,
but the fact of the matter is you've gotten close enough to something that you're wrapped up in some charges. You don't think that it's in the best interest of your district to let somebody else who's not going to be sidetracked and distracted by that kind of stuff going on represent the district? That just means it's really about you. It's not about the people. It's not about your constituents. It's not about the area you represent. It's about you like your job and you don't want to lose it, and they can't push you out, so who cares? And I don't like that.
It's bizarre. Yeah. It's a really bizarre situation. And for it to unfold so quickly before the general election, I think is a really, really big deal. So with that being said, what are we looking at for stories of the week? What are we looking at, or what are you paying attention to now that we're in this sort of lull before the general election, before things really start to heat up? I know I've been paying attention to these stories that we've been seeing coming out of the race for the 23rd congressional district. The debate schedule was released by Reed's campaign. All of them happening in the southern tier, none of them happening in the northern or central Finger Lakes. Disappointing, I guess, from my point of view, but at the end of the day, those races are going to be decided by how good the turnout is in November. So if you're uncomfortable with this situation, if you're uncomfortable with the stories that you're seeing about Reed, about Mitrano, about whoever insert political name here,
right,
get out and vote November, and that will make a difference.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I'm watching the same thing, and also the congressional race up around Syracuse. I cannot remember the district number,
24.
Fourth. And again, I mean, I think we're seeing, from trade policy to immigration to healthcare, like there isn't a major national issue that isn't having a severe local impact. I was going to say for good or bad, but I really think mostly for bad. And now you have a group of Republican legislators, including Chris Collins, who have tried all along to say, actually, this is all good, this is going to be great, this is going to be wonderful, this is the best thing to do. And I'm just wondering how they come back to their districts and say, okay, actually, the things I'm approving are really making you suffer, but hang in there, it's for the greater good. So that's what I'm looking at. I'm looking at the spin that they're trying to put on what's actually happening in the districts. People are not making more money. People are not feeling more safe. People are not, getting the health care that they need. People are not getting adequate treatment for opioids and other addictions. So how exactly have they been working for us?
Good question. Stuff that I think voters are starting to ask the questions, but
yeah.
I'm not sure any of the candidates that I've heard thus far on either side of the aisle have really been giving strong, in-depth answers on how they want to address these things. So I will be interested to see how the next several weeks play out before the general.
Yeah.
But that's it. That's going to do it for this week's show. Thanks to our listeners and FingerLakes1.com for making the program possible. Remember, we are on iTunes, Stitcher, and the FingerLakes1.com app. For Jackie Augustine, I'm Josh Durso. Stay informed, Finger Lakes, and we will catch you next time. Maybe use less plastic straws, too.